Ready for some serious brain food? We're diving into Bertrand Russell's A History of Western Philosophy.
Oh, a classic.
Now, I know you might be thinking, philosophy, isn't that just like a bunch of old guys arguing about stuff?
Yeah, I can see that.
But trust me on this, Russell makes it surprisingly fun and engaging.
He really does. He had this way of taking even the most complex ideas and making them, well, clear, witty even.
Exactly. And it's not just that. It's not just the way he writes. He was a mathematician too, right?
Right, and you can see that analytical mind shining through in every chapter. He brings this clarity to these big philosophical questions.
That's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're exploring how those ancient ideas, the way Russell lays them out, still resonate with us today.
They really do.
So we'll be uncovering those hidden connections, those aha moments that make you see the world a little differently.
And we'll start, just as Russell does, with the ancient Greeks.
Perfect. So where do we even begin with ancient Greek philosophy? It feels like such a vast landscape.
It is vast. Russell starts with a figure you might not expect, Pythagoras. You know, the theorem guy.
Right, of course. Triangles and all that.
Exactly. But here's the thing. He's not just about triangles. Pythagoras also influenced how we think about knowledge itself.
Okay, now you've got my attention. How so?
Well, Pythagoreanism, it was this fascinating blend of mathematics and, get this, mystical theology.
Wait, math and theology, those seem like, well, totally different things. How do those go together?
I know, right? But the Pythagoreans, they believed numbers were the key to unlocking the universe's secrets. And this idea, this connection between numbers and, like, cosmic truth, it had a huge impact. I mean, we're talking Plato, early Christian theologians, they were all influenced by this idea in some way.
I could kind of see it. It's like when you have those moments where you realize, wow, math isn't just about equations, it's about the fundamental building blocks of reality.
Exactly. And, you know, that brings us to another big thinker who was also obsessed with how we understand reality, Parmenides. And he was fixated on the limits of language.
Oh, okay. Language. How does that fit into all of this?
So Parmenides, he argued that language, it can both reveal and distort reality.
Meaning?
He believed that true reality, it's unchanging, it's eternal. But our senses, all the things we perceive as changing, that's the illusion.
So it's like that feeling you get when you experience something amazing, but then when you try to put it into words, it just falls short. Like the words can't quite capture it.
Yes, you've got it. Russell uses a great example to explain this. George Washington's name.
George Washington. Okay, I'm intrigued.
He points out that the name George Washington, its meaning, it changes depending on who's saying it and when.
Oh, that's a really interesting way to think about it.
Right.
So for Washington himself, his name meant something different than it did to his friends, his enemies, and it definitely means something totally different to us today.
Exactly. The point is, language is always evolving. And for Parmenides, that pointed to something really fundamental about the nature of truth itself.
It's like we're all kind of fumbling around in this world of shifting meaning. No wonder those ancient Greeks spent so much time pondering, the nature of existence and reality.
I know, right? And, this leads us to a group that Russell finds surprisingly modern in their thinking. The atomists.
The atomists.
Yeah, Democritus and Leucippus, they're the ones who gave us the concept of atoms in the void.
Wait, hold on. They figured that out centuries before microscope.
I know, it's remarkable. They used this idea of atoms, these tiny indivisible particles, to explain, everything, how the universe worked mechanistically.
Wow, so they weren't just saying it's all random chance or something.
Not at all. They were actually determinists. They believed in a universe governed by natural laws. It's just that they saw those laws as playing out on a tiny invisible scale.
So essentially they were doing physics with philosophy. It's incredible what they were able to deduce without the tools we have today.
It really is. And it makes you appreciate the limitations that even brilliant minds face, right? Which, speaking of brilliant minds, brings us to Aristotle. And he's a figure Russell has very complicated feelings about.
Oh, what's the deal with Aristotle? He's considered one of the most important thinkers of all time.
He is. He's undeniably influential.
Yeah.
Russell argues that some of Aristotle's ideas, they actually ended up holding back scientific progress.
Okay, now I need details. What did Aristotle get wrong?
Well, for one, his idea of an unchanging celestial sphere, it really messed with the development of astronomy for centuries.
Oh, I see.
And his system of logic, while impressive, became this rigid framework that kind of stifled new ways of thinking.
So it's like he was so busy building a perfect system that he didn't leave much room for new discoveries that might challenge his foundations.
Exactly. And that actually brings up a key point that Russell makes about the relationship between economic prosperity and, well, intellectual growth.
Mm.
He argues that the flourishing of Greek philosophy, it was deeply intertwined with the unique conditions of ancient Greece at the time.
You mean like the whole togas and amphitheaters thing?
Well, yes, but more specifically, Russell points to the fact that they had all these city-states, right?
Mm.
And they had commercial wealth and this openness to foreign ideas. It created this incredibly dynamic exchange of perspectives.
It was like a marketplace for ideas.
Exactly. A marketplace where philosophy could thrive.
Which makes sense. If you're struggling just to survive, you're probably not going to spend a lot of time debating the finer points of metaphysics.
Right. But if you have some breathing room, some economic security, you have the freedom to explore those bigger questions.
Exactly. So what happened as things changed?
Well, that's the fascinating part. As those city-states declined, right,
Mm.
and larger empires, like the Macedonian and Roman empires, as they rose to prominence, Greek thought underwent a noticeable shift.
How so?
Well, the focus shifted away from this earlier emphasis on social cohesion, civic duty, ideas deeply rooted in that city-state structure,
Okay.
and it moved toward a more individualistic ethic.
Interesting. Because suddenly the world is bigger.
Exactly. It's like if your world expands from a small city-state to this vast empire, your relationship to that world, to power, it changes.
So you're no longer as connected to the collective good of your city-state,
Yeah.
and you're more focused on your own place in this vast kind of impersonal empire.
Exactly. And this is where we see the emergence of Stoicism, the school of thought that really emphasized personal ethics, virtue, and a more, individual relationship to the divine.
It's like in those moments when the world feels chaotic and uncertain, the only thing you can control is your own response, your own actions.
That's the essence of Stoicism. And this focus on the individual's moral compass, well, it brings us to, I think, a pivotal moment in Western thought. The trial of Socrates.
Socrates,
Yeah.
the original gadfly, right?
Right.
Questioning everything and everyone. But seriously, why is his trial still relevant to us centuries later?
Because it highlights this tension between the individual and society, between freedom of thought and the demands of authority.
And it didn't end well for Socrates.
No, it didn't. But what's fascinating is how Russell brings to life the political and social undercurrents of the time that led to those charges against Socrates.
So it wasn't just about his philosophical ideas, right?
Yeah.
It was about his perceived allegiance to the aristocracy, his willingness to question those in power.
Exactly. And then there's the drama of it all. Here's Socrates literally on trial for his life. And how does he choose to use his defense? Not to beg for mercy, but to deliver this scathing critique of Athenian society and its values.
Wow. He was a man who knew how to make a statement. And it's a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge, the questioning of authority, it can come at a steep price.
It absolutely can. And, that brings us to the Roman period. Now, the Romans, they weren't exactly known for their philosophical originality.
That's true, more known for their armies and aqueducts.
Right, exactly. But Russell argues that their pragmatism, their focus on stability, it ironically played a crucial role in ensuring that Greek thought endured.
So, too busy conquering the world to come up with their own philosophies.
In a way, yes, but it's more than that. It's like their very lack of philosophical zeal made them, in a way, the perfect custodians for these ideas that had originated in Greece.
Interesting. So they were caretakers of a sort.
Yes. Russell calls them the reluctant preservers of Greek thought.
Reluctant preservers. I like that.
He even goes so far as to suggest that if someone like, say, Genghis Khan had come along earlier,
Oh, wow.
the entire trajectory of Western philosophy might have been wiped out.
Wow. That's kind of a chilling thought.
It is.
It really makes you appreciate how these historical accidents, these unexpected turns of events, really shape the course of, well, civilization.
They do. And speaking of unexpected turns, within that context of Roman order, a new force was emerging that would reshape the Western world. Christianity.
And that changes everything.
Right.
How does Russell approach the rise of Christianity in this Roman world?
Well, he points out that initially, Christianity, it was a largely unpolitical movement. It was focused on personal salvation, a rejection of worldly concerns.
Which, of course, is kind of ironic given what happens next.
Exactly. But as we know, it eventually became the dominant force in the West. It shaped not only religious beliefs, but political structures, social norms, even philosophical inquiry for centuries to come.
It's a testament to the power of ideas, how they can transform not just individual lives, but entire civilizations.
Absolutely.
And this brings us to the rise of the Catholic Church, which Russell describes as this fascinating blend of honestly seemingly disparate traditions.
He's right. You've got Greek philosophy, Roman pragmatism, early Christian theology. You even have elements of Eastern thought, all coming together under this umbrella of the Catholic Church. It's no wonder its influence on Western thought has been so profound and enduring.
It's like the church became this grand intellectual melting pot, blending together these really diverse ingredients into something entirely new. But even with this grand synthesis, there were bound to be, some cracks in the facade, right?
Oh, absolutely. And Russell really gets into the inherent tension between the church's otherworldly doctrines and its very worldly pursuit of power.
It's like that old saying, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Or, in this case, maybe it's more like, the spirit is otherworldly, but the institution is very much of this world.
Expert speaker laughs.
Right.
That is a perfect way to put it. And Russell, he illustrates this tension brilliantly. He talks about figures like Pope Gregory I.
Okay, Pope Gregory I. Tell me more.
He had this reputation for piety, but he was also a master strategist, a political operator.
So he's consolidating papal authority, right?
Yeah.
Playing power politics with kings and emperors.
Yeah.
But at the same time, writing about humility, detachment from worldly concerns. Talk about a study in contrast.
Exactly. He embodies that complex, often contradictory relationship between spiritual ideals and the very real, very messy business of wielding power in the world.
It's a theme that we see again and again throughout history, isn't it? Even the most well-intentioned individuals, the most well-intentioned institutions can get caught up in the, let's be honest, intoxicating allure of power.
It's true.
And as the church's power grew, so did the chorus of voices questioning its authority.
Which brings us to the Reformation, this period of immense upheaval and questioning that, let's be honest, forever altered the landscape of Western Christianity.
Right. It's like this pressure cooker of social, economic, and intellectual forces just finally erupts.
Exactly. You have the rise of a wealthy merchant class, the spread of literacy thanks to the printing press, and of course a growing awareness of the church's corruption and hypocrisy. It was only a matter of time before something had to give. And what's fascinating is how Russell connects these historical forces to deeper philosophical shifts. He argues that the Reformation, while ostensibly about religious doctrine, also opened the door for this new emphasis on individual perspective and interpretation.
It's like that moment when you realize that even the most rigid structures of authority can be challenged, that even the most deeply held beliefs can be questioned. It's a testament to that enduring power of the human spirit to seek truth, to demand accountability. But you know what? We're going to have to save that for part 2.
It's true, the Reformation really was a major turning point. You could say it really shifted the authority on truth, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's like that realization that you're not just inheriting ideas. You can actually question them. You can interpret them. You can find your own truth. But it wasn't exactly smooth sailing from there, was it? So much was happening at the time. What happens after the Reformation shakes things up?
Well, Russell argues that even as the Reformation was challenging the church, there's another revolution brewing, you see. And this one's a big one. The scientific revolution.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, this is huge. We're talking a major shift from religious dogma to observation, experimentation, reason. Those become the tools we use to understand the universe.
Exactly. And this is where figures like Descartes, Hobbes, and Locke, they come onto the scene. They were really grappling with what this new scientific worldview meant for how we see ourselves, society, how we relate to the divine.
It's like the old ways of thinking. They just got tossed out the window. And now these philosophers, they're trying to write a new set of rules, one that takes into account this completely different way of seeing the world.
Exactly. And take Descartes, for example. He's the one who famously said, "I think, therefore I am."
Oh, yeah, everyone knows that one. But it's actually really profound when you really think about it.
It is. He's essentially saying that even if everything around us is an illusion, even if we can doubt everything else, the very act of thinking, of doubting, proves that we exist.
It's this radical affirmation of the individual in a world that's becoming increasingly complex.
Right. And then you have Hobbes, who's writing during the English Civil War, so you can imagine, a time of just immense upheaval. And he's really wrestling with the nature of political power, arguing that you need a strong sovereign to prevent society from descending into chaos.
I feel like Hobbes gets a bad rap sometimes for being kind of a downer.
Right.
Like he's saying humans are inherently bad and we need to be controlled.
Well, he was definitely a realist. Let's put it that way. But his idea is about the social contract, the idea that we need some kind of power to maintain order. Those ideas are still relevant today.
I mean, it makes you wonder, right? Do we crave order and stability, even if it means giving up some freedom is something we're still debating today?
A question for the ages. And speaking of individual freedom, that brings us to John Locke. He's the one who really championed those ideas about natural rights, limited government, the whole shebang.
Right. Locke, the champion of liberty, life, liberty, property. It's all there in the Declaration of Independence.
Exactly. He articulated this radical idea that governments, they get their power from the consent of the governed, not from some divine right, not because they say so. It's the people who give them legitimacy.
Such a powerful idea. It's the foundation of democracy.
Yeah.
But it's also complicated, right? Because what happens when people disagree? How do you balance individual rights with what's good for everyone?
Big questions. And those are the questions that we're still grappling with today. It's what makes studying philosophy so relevant.
Absolutely. It's not just about the past. It's about understanding the ideas that shape our world today.
Exactly. And as we move into the 18th century, well, things get even more interesting. We hit the Enlightenment, a time of incredible intellectual energy, a real belief in the power of reason to solve problems and make the world a better place. This is where Voltaire, Rousseau, Kant, they all come in.
Right. The Enlightenment, it's like this explosion of ideas,
Yeah.
coffee houses, salons, revolutions. It feels like a turning point for Western thought.
It was. It was a time of immense optimism in human reason. Voltaire, for example, he challenged authority, he championed free speech, he fought against intolerance.
Yeah, he was like the Jon Stewart of his day, right? Using wit and satire to point out hypocrisy.
Exactly. And then there's Rousseau. He's exploring the idea of the social contract, but in a different way than a Hobbes. He's saying we willingly give up some rights in exchange for the benefits of living in a society. He also brings up this idea of the general will.
The general will. Sounds a bit like the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or something.
It does. But the concept of the general will, it's tricky. It's been used to justify suppressing individual rights in the name of the collective.
Ah, I see. So even good intentions can go wrong.
Right. And speaking of tricky ideas, we can't talk about the Enlightenment without talking about Immanuel Kant.
Kant. He's a tough one. Even for philosophy nerds like me, his ideas can be pretty dense.
He is notoriously challenging, but Russell does a great job breaking it down. One key idea is Kant's distinction between the phenomenal world, the world we experience with our senses, and the noumenal world.
Okay, the noumenal world.
Right, which is the world of things in themselves.
Yeah.
It's a world we can never truly know.
So are we trapped, like stuck in our own little bubbles of perception, never really able to grasp the true nature of reality?
In a way, yes. But here's the thing. Kant also argued that even though we can't know the noumenal world directly, we can use reason to figure out certain universal truths about it. That's where his famous categorical imperative comes in.
Right, the categorical imperative, it's like this moral law within, right? What's the Tail Doc Ray version?
It's essentially the idea that certain moral laws are binding on everyone, no matter who you are, what you want, what your circumstances are. These laws are based on reason and logic, not emotions or social norms.
So even though we're all stuck in our own subjective worlds, there's this shared moral framework that connects us as rational beings.
That's the idea. And Kant believed that reason, if we really used it, could lead us to a universal morality, a set of principles that could guide us towards a more just world.
It's kind of amazing to think about, we're still wrestling with these same questions about morality and reason that Kant was dealing with centuries ago. It really makes you realize some things never change.
It's true. And as we move into the 19th century with Russell, the landscape of philosophy, it just explodes. It's the era of romanticism, of industrialization. Revolutions are happening all over Europe. It was a time of just massive change, both intellectually and socially.
So how did philosophy respond to all of this? Did it kind of retreat into the ivory tower, or did it get its hands dirty?
Oh, philosophy definitely got its hands dirty. Thinkers like Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, they weren't afraid to tackle these big changes head on. They offered radical new ways of thinking about history, society, what it means to be human.
Okay, let's start with Hegel. Who was he and what was his big idea?
Hegel, well, he's known for having a pretty dense philosophical system. But at its heart, there's this idea of the dialectic.
The dialectic.
Yeah, it's this back and forth movement of ideas, kind of like a constant conversation. And Hegel believed that this movement is what drives history forward.
So it's not just a random series of events. It's like history is following a pattern.
Exactly. Hegel saw history as this unfolding of what he called the absolute spirit. And every stage of development builds on what came before.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So history is having this conversation with itself, always questioning, challenging, refining its own ideas.
Exactly. And for Hegel, this whole process, it was leading toward a greater understanding of ourselves, of the universe even.
That's a pretty optimistic way of looking at history, don't you think? Especially considering all the conflict and suffering along the way.
You're right, not everyone saw it that way. And that's where Karl Marx comes in.
Of course, Karl Marx. He had some different ideas about history, didn't he?
He did. He was influenced by Hegel, especially this idea of the dialectic. But Marx gave it a very materialistic twist.
What do you mean?
Well, instead of ideas driving history forward, Marx said it's the material conditions of life, the economic forces that really matter.
So forget the ivory tower. Marx is saying we need to look at the real conditions that shape people's lives. The factories, the wages, all of it.
Exactly. He argued that capitalism, for all its progress, it creates the system where a few people benefit at the expense of everyone else. And he predicted, famously, that this would lead to revolution.
And you can't deny his impact. I mean, Marx's ideas about class struggle, about economic power, they're more relevant than ever.
Absolutely. Love him or hate him, Marx changed the way we think about the world. And, speaking of changing the way we think, that brings us to another giant of the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche.
Okay, Nietzsche. Now, he was a bit of a rebel, wasn't he?
He was. He questioned everything. He was critical of traditional morality, organized religion, even the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason.
So if Marx wanted to bring philosophy back down to earth, Nietzsche was shaking things up even more.
Exactly. He's famous for saying, God is dead.
God is dead. Subtle. What did he mean by that?
He was saying that the old values, the belief systems that had given meaning to Western civilization for centuries, they were no longer relevant in the modern world.
A pretty bold statement to make even now.
Yeah.
And what did he offer in place of those old values?
Well, that's where Nietzsche gets really interesting. He urged people to embrace what he called the will to power. It's this primal force within us, he said, to create, to overcome, to become something more.
So we shouldn't look outside ourselves for meaning, no God, no religion. It's all about looking inward.
That was his big idea. He believed that without God, we are free to create our own values, our own meaning. And that's a scary thought for some people, but for others, it's incredibly liberating.
It's like he's saying the old rules are gone. Now it's up to us to figure things out, to find our own way, which is exciting and terrifying at the same time.
Exactly. And that's what makes Nietzsche such an enduring figure. He forces us to confront these really big questions, the really uncomfortable ones, and to find our own answers.
It's a lot to think about. And, this whole journey that Russell takes us on through the history of Western philosophy, it's incredible. From the ancient Greeks all the way to the 20th century. It really shows how these ideas, these thinkers, they're still relevant to our lives today.
That's the power of philosophy, isn't it? It's not just about the past, it's about understanding the ideas that shape our world, our values, the choices we make every single day.
It makes you realize that these conversations, these debates, they've been going on for centuries. And we're all part of that conversation now, whether we realize it or not.
Exactly. So keep those questions coming.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a history of Western philosophy with Bertrand Russell. We hope you've learned something new, challenged your own assumptions, and maybe even feel inspired to do some philosophical exploring of your own.
And remember, the journey's never really over, is it? There's always more to discover. So keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.